A Condensed Guide to Marxism, From the Critique of Capitalism to the Classless Society, by RobinGoodFellow. Introduction. After the defeat of the great proletarian struggles of the 1920s, the longest counter-revolution in history has helped to obscure the basics of revolutionary theory, even for militants. In its Stalinist, social democratic, and leftist versions, or in the attempts made by the representative of the bourgeoisie to explain it, Marxism has been distorted. It no longer has anything to do with the powerful critique of bourgeois society, with the scientific theory that starting in the mid-1840s explained the genesis, development, and death of this society and foresaw the end of class society. On the occasion of the crisis that convulsed the capitalist economy in 2008 to 2010, one part of the international bourgeois press thought that the time had come to offer a tip of the hat to Marx, but it did so by saluting the, quote, visionary of the difficulties of capitalism, rather than the revolutionary who demonstrated the intimate link between the crises and the need to abolish them. Thanks to this fact that we can situate ourselves at the point of view of the proletariat, that we defend its historic program, that we call upon it constitutive itself as a distinct political party opposed to the other parties, and to conquer political power for the purpose of establishing a society free of social classes and the state, wage labor, money, and the categories of the commodity. We defend the revolutionary content of that theory, far removed from, and contrary to, all official or academic recognition. This little book, which summarizes the essential points of the communist critique of political economy, seeks to provide all those who are looking for a radical critique of today's society with a condensed version of the coherence and power of revolutionary theory. Its purpose is above all to show that the communist future is not an ideal, nor is it a mere desire or a utopia, but is necessarily inscribed in the very development of the bourgeois society that rests upon the exploitation of the productive class, the proletariat. Socialism has become a science, and must be studied as such. The only school in which it can be understood, transmitted, and further developed is the proletarian party. In the historic meaning of the term, the authors of this work fully lay claim to this tradition and do not concede any validity to the critiques of Marxism, like those modernization attempts undertaken by bourgeois or reformist wise men, economists, and university professors. This text is for a class in struggle, a class that instinctively knows what exploitation represents and is seeking to provide itself with solid theoretical tools to face the battle of the future. We have ventured upon the difficult project of vulgarizing a corpus of complex scientific thought. Revolutionary socialism is scientific in the sense that it gives an explanation of reality, and it is militant in the sense that it passionately defends the need for the revolution. In certain cases, the vocabulary of the past can be an obstacle to understanding the phenomena that are described. For example, in the expansion of labor power, the word power is a relic of the physics of the 19th century, when it was used to describe what goes by another name today. While we have continued to use this concept, we have, however, attempted to explain it in today's language, in which it might be translated as labor's potential capacity for work, a term already used by Marx. At the same time, the risk of vulgarization lies in the reduction of complex proofs by an exaggerated simplification of certain concepts or phenomena. The reader who wants to obtain a deeper understanding of certain topics addressed in this book may refer to our more theoretical texts, which are available in many languages at our website, RobinGoodFellow.info. And obviously, by reading the original text at the present, they may be consulted at numerous websites, although not always in the best translations. We make this text more readable. We decided to limit the number of quotations from Marx and Engels to a few exceptional cases where the clarity of the original formulation cannot be surpassed. Marxism is a science, and therefore a living theory, whose concepts have held up remarkably well when confronted by the complexity of our contemporary world, whereas bourgeois political economy, on the other hand, not to speak of its philosophy or its sociology, is increasingly more stupid. This does not make it any less necessary to engage in a considerable effort to make this theory more accurate, to refine its concepts, to apply them precisely to the phenomena of today, its capitalist mode of production, and to do so within general programmatic framework defined by this theory. Without revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary activity. Lenin said this is more true today than ever before. The historical development of the capitalist mode of production. The unprecedented development of the capitalist economy and the attenuation of the crises that followed the end of the Second World War in the West for 30 years, the collapse of the false communisms of the East, and the rise of the development of new capitalist countries on every continent, and last but not least, the never-ending counter-revolution that, since the 1920s, has reduced the influence of revolutionary communism to almost nothing, have helped to spread the belief that the capitalist system had won its eternal life on Earth. For the rulers, economists, journalists, and other representatives of the bourgeoisie, there is no doubt about it. Nothing can escape capitalism. The economy, always understood as capitalist, seems to have become as natural as the air that we breathe. It even seems impossible to imagine that a society could work, live, reproduce, and develop without these categories known as money, market, exchange, and wage labor. That life would be possible by using the products of labor without there being commodities. None of these categories, however, whose scientific definitions as set forth by Marxism shall recapitulate in the next chapter, are eternal. They have not always existed, and Marxism provides that they have become obstacles to the development of society. To further its development, capital was forced to fundamentally transform the relations of production among humans, the modalities of production, and create the preconditions for its own development. This process was far from peaceful and idyllic. 2.1. The preconditions for the capitalist mode of production. Marx ridiculed those bourgeois economists who offered a virtuous fable to explain the origins of the great fortunes that constituted the first foundation of merchant capitalism. According to this fable, they were the fruits of patiently accumulated savings by generations of sober and industrious entrepreneurs, while incompetents and those who gave themselves up to a life of pleasure were without resources and obliged to sell their labor. Obviously, that is not how history produced the two principal preconditions for capitalist exploitation: the existence of a mass of laborers, which, with neither hell or hearth nor home, the proletariat, on the other side, and a class of capitalists who monopolize the money and the means of production and subsistence, that create a situation where the latter can hire the former for a wage. It was through expropriation, state intervention, and cruel legislation, whose purpose was to discipline and contain the nascent proletariat through looting, robbery, pillage, murder, and other forms of violence. The slave trade, forced labor, the public debt, taxes, trade wars, and protectionism, that these preconditions were opposed and further developed. 2.1.1. The development of the proletariat. The capitalist economic structure emerged from the dissolution of feudal society. What was needed was a free laborer who had disposal over his own person, and therefore one who was liberated from serfdom and from the power of the guilds. The creation of the proletariat is therefore the concentration at the other pole of society of a mass of free men. At this point, we must make it clear that they are, quote, free to sell their capacity for labor to the possessors of capital. There must also be a class that possesses something else besides its, quote, labor in a potential state, a class that is before it the necessary means for the performance of their labor, the tools, the raw material, the workplace. Unlike the artisan, who is simultaneously the owner of his tools and the person who does the work, the proletariat can do nothing because it is, in the manner of speaking, naked before the capitalist. What this entails is a radical separation of the means of production, a separation that would only become more pronounced over the course of the existence of the capitalist mode of production. In England, for example, under feudalism, one part of the land was known as the commons. This land did not belong to the lords, but remained the common property of the residents of each town or village. While in the commons, the village residents could freely pasture their animals, or they could cultivate parcels without thereby appropriating to their exclusive ownership the land they used, and therefore this form of land use was not a form of private property. In the 17th century, the so-called enclosures movement was accelerated by state intervention, by means of legislation voted by Parliament. It was by way of this deliberate act that the part of the peasantry was expropriated and made available for sale to capital. In Chapter 23 of Volume 1 of Capital, devoted to colonization, Marx used this particular mode of capital's expansion to prove that what makes capital is not the means of production as such, but the fact that these means of production confront a mass of dispossessed proletarians. In other words, to produce surplus value, what is necessary is not just capital, but this capital must be confronted by a mass of proletarians who had been dispossessed of everything. While the bourgeois economists reconstructed the past in an idyllic form to explain how modern society was born, Marx turned to the places where the constitution of capital relations can be directly observed, the colonies, where the producer still possesses the means of production in the land, a state of affairs that had not prevailed in England for several centuries. In the colonies, he said, one may behold the secret of political economy, in which without the expropriation of workers, the capital relation cannot function. In Europe, expropriation was the subject of the masses to the discipline of factory labor, the poor laws of the 17th and 18th century, the persecution of vagabonds, and other coercive measures were utilized to create a subdue of masses of the proletarian whose existence is necessary for the development of the capitalist mode of production. The history of their expropriation and their domestication in order to imprison them in the factories was written in letters of fire and blood. But only with the advent of more highly developed capitalist production, which followed in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, did the expropriation of the immense majority of the rural population become radicalized, and the separation between agriculture and domestic production, weaving and spinning, was finally consummated. 2.1.2 Genesis of the capitalist class. In order for the capitalist mode of production to develop, money and commodities must be susceptible to being turned into capital. To put it another way, on one hand, there must be money, means of production and subsistence, and on the other hand, there must be a class of free workers. The mere existence of such a class of free workers does not create a class of capitalists. The latter has multiple organs. The capitalist farmer, in its oldest form, has emerged gradually, later as a counterstroke against the agrarian revolution of the late 15th century and early 16th century. A domestic market was opened up for industrial products and a capitalist class was encouraged to develop within this sector. This class came in part from the masters of the guilds, in part from the artisans, that is, from the wage workers who had become capitalist entrepreneurs, but above all, from the existence of a kind of labor. A legacy of the Middle Ages, which possessed the scope of capital, before the capitalist era, merchant and banking capital. In the hands of these merchants and bankers, there was a sufficient mass of accumulated capital that could be transformed into industrial capital, that is, could buy means of production in higher free labor power for a wage. It was on this basis of these, quote, antediluvian forms of capital that the expression of modern capitalism developed. Before the emergence of these forms, merchant capital for the most part played a role in the development of exchange insofar as its speciality was the social function of the exchange. That is, instead of the apple farmer going to the market to sell his apples and then buying shoes from the shoemaker, we are no longer dealing with barter, but with monetary exchange. The possessor of merchant capital acts as an intermediary between the different agents of production. One of the paths that had the subsequent development of the capitalist mode of production would follow was that of centralization on the part of merchant capital and of the means of production in its central locations, which would favor the increase in the productivity of labor. Thus, capital begins by socializing exchange rather than labor. Thus, from the beginning, the function of the capitalist class is neither possible nor explicable without taking into account its relation between the two antagonistic classes, where one of them, the capitalist class, can only cement its rule over the other, the proletariat, by exploiting it. We shall now take a brief look at how, on the basis of this first impulse, the historical movement of the capitalist class mode of production develops. 2.2 Stages of capitalist development. Capital has unfolded throughout its history by ceaseless accentuating the factor that determines its emergence. That is, by valorizing capital, by buying labor power that is capable of producing more value than it costs. We shall see in more detail in the second chapter how the scientific work of Marx has provided the key to explaining the extortion of surplus value. Over the course of its development, the nature of capital has not changed, and capital has, in fact, fulfilled its purpose all the more effectively, to produce a maximum surplus value. By doing so, the bourgeoisie unites and expands the means of production, and develops the productive power of labor. One of the consequences of this is the socialization of the means of production and of the products of labor. Furthermore, the modern capitalist mode of production clears the way to an unlimited development of the productivity of labor. This latter development contradicts the limited goal of capital, the quest for a maximum of surplus value, and calls for another society, a society for which capitalism has produced the foundations, a society that will no longer be based on the exploitation of wage labor. In this process, Marx distinguishes three stages that have followed one another since the middle of the 14th century: simple cooperation, manufacture and machine industry. Capitalist production presupposes from its origin the exploitation of a significant mass of workers, under the command of a single capital, which, in order to pay wages on such a scale as well as to acquire means of production, must have attained a certain size. The organization guarantees that the competitive labor power that cooperates in production will have in productivity that is consistent with that of socially average productivity, and by virtue of economic scale, expenditures on means of production, for buildings and maintenance, for example, will decrease the cooperation of these bearers of labor power. The creation of a collective worker also allows for the extension of the range of jobs that can be performed under the aegis of capital, large-scale construction projects, for example, and improve social productivity. This simple cooperation, that large-scale production, is re-encountered through capitalist production and is a characteristic of a certain stage of infancy of capitalist production is craft-based manufacture and large-scale agriculture. With the beginning of the manufacturing period, properly speaking, which extends from around the middle of the 16th century to the last third of the 18th century, a kind of cooperation was established that was based on a new division of labor. We have seen that the agrarian revolution of the end of the 15th and beginning of the 16th century favored this craft-based manufacturing system, and the system was the dominant form of capitalist mode of production, when the capitalist era really began. Without going into detail concerning the various types of manufacture, we shall emphasize the specificity of the division of labor that was the characteristic of the manufacturing period. The collective worker is constituted by the concentrating in one piece a large number of workers performing particular tasks. At the same time, one observes a differentiation and specialization of the instruments of labor, even though there was a tendency to subdivide tasks, to create a hierarchy between skilled and unskilled workers, to reduce the expenses of training, and to mutilate the worker by extreme specialization. The craft or trade was still the basis of manufacture and the springboard of proletarian resistance. With the development of manufacturing production, this narrow technical basis enters into contradiction with the need of production. Machines were invented to overcome this contradiction. 2.3. Machine industry and the Industrial Revolution and the growth of productivity. In this section of Volume 1 of Capital, that deals with the modern industry, Marx devotes a chapter to machinery and modern industry. He begins by recalling a fundamental point of revolutionary communism. All progress of the productive powers of labor is progress in the exploitation of proletarian labor power, and in the refinement of this exploitation. Thus, the immediate result of machinery is to augment surplus value. The apologists for technical progress should reacquaint themselves with this lesson, since technical progress has been turned directly against the proletariat. It is synonymous with the development of relative surplus value of the increase in the exploitation of labor. It is synonymous with the accentuated valorization of capital due to the increase of surplus value. Socialism has made use of this concept of the Industrial Revolution to define that movement, which corresponds in Europe with the beginning of big industry in the 18th century after the transitional stage of manufacture, when mechanical production took over from manual production, in which the hand tool was crucial. The tool manipulated in the past by the hand of men is now transformed into a component of the tool machine. Before the worker used the tool, now he serves the machine. As long as production was still based on the manual use of the tool, Even when production was reorganized, as in the case of manufacture, there were limits to the growth of the productivity of labor. With the machine, the perspective on the limited development of the productivity of labor was revealed. The Industrial Revolution did not take the form of the creation of machines that are the extensions of machines, but that of the elimination of man from the productive process. The phenomenon opens up vast perspective for the development of the productivity of labor. On one hand, the number of tools working simultaneously can be multiplied, and on the other hand, the speed can be increased. Machinery seizes upon all aspects of production, which are connected together by being separate phases of a process. Progress in one branch also brings progress to the other branches. Large-scale weaving and spinning, for example, brings advancements in chemical industries for dyes and so on. The capitalist mode of production thus contributes to the unification of all human activities and to the constitution of an interdependent process of social metabolism. By unifying the industrial fabric, by associating all the branches of production, by considerably developing the productivity of labor, capital creates the preconditions for a society where collective and social reproduction will allow for free individual development. However, this logic pertaining to technical development must not be viewed only from the perspective of machine, nor should it be viewed as a process that is separate from the social form in which it is inscribed. Driven forward by the movement of capital valorization, the movement of integration of technologies produces social effects that are fundamental for the evolution of humanity, starting with the unification of the productive class, the proletariat. This is especially important because socialism speaks of an industrial revolution with respect to the phenomenon of machine industry. This is not just a technological development, a new invention in the history of humanity. Its advent establishes the material foundation of communism and allows for an unlimited development of productivity and a permanent reduction of necessary labor time, creating the basis for a society of abundance. That is not all, however. Machinery industry leads to a labor process that is specific to the capitalist mode of production and creates an enduring form of associated social labor. It creates the class of associated producers who must free themselves from the dictatorship of capital in order to fulfill the potential of machine industry, in order to raise to another level, a higher level, the magnitude of the productive power of labor. Potentially, by virtue of its own concept, the Industrial Revolution leads to the perspective of a classless society, communist society. With the Industrial Revolution, the bourgeoisie set in motion productive forces that enter into conflict with the exclusive and limited goal of capitalist production, the quest for the maximum surplus value. This conflict between the tendency towards the unlimited development of the productive forces and the revelations of production characteristics of the capitalist mode of production is manifested in general crises of overproduction. Catastrophic crises in the sense that society, for social reasons, is devastated, as if by natural catastrophe, which periodically remind us that the time has come for a new society. The tendency of these crises is that they are becoming more extensive and are leading towards a violent collapse of capital. Throughout history, the development of humanity takes place in a contradictory fashion, by way of class societies, conflicts, and various contradictions. And at every step of the way, the question of social productivity is central. As long as human species devotes the great part of its time to assuring its necessary subsistence, the question of socialism cannot be posed, even if in the form of millenarian and utopian religious movements, the idea of an egalitarian society has left its imprint on the depths of history. The capitalist mode of production is the first mode of production in history in which productivity develops on a social basis that allows for the perspective of a satisfaction of social needs that goes beyond the simple reproduction of the species. 3. Some basic concepts of Marxist theory. 3.1. Definition of the commodity. A commodity is any material object or service produced for the purpose of being exchanged. The commodity has not always existed. The Indian tribes of North America, for example, were unfamiliar with it until the arrival of the European colonists. Products were made and consumed collectively. Among the first appearance of the commodity, as far as we know today, societies developed that were only partially based on commodity exchange. That is, such exchange involved only certain activities, as in the Middle Ages, when the villagers were still able to live on their own produce. Only with the capitalist mode of production was the realm of commodity generalized. Today, The objects that we use on a daily basis are commodities, whether they're tangible things like our food, clothing, and furniture, or services like mass transit or various leisure activities. It must not be forgotten that the commodity is not just a matter of individual consumption. Machinery, raw materials, factory and office buildings, the instruments of labor, and especially the labor power of the wage workers themselves are also commodities. It is their mode of production that differentiates them. Marx speaks of the productive consumption in the connection with the commodities that are consumed in the production process. 3.2. Use value and exchange value. All these commodities have a use for those who buy them. The social utility of certain objects or gadgets may be debatable, but this is not the place to address this issue. This is called their value of utility, or more precisely, their use value. The use value of an object, of a commodity, is its usefulness to me and the reason why I want to possess it. Up to this point, this idea is perfectly understandable for everyone. It remains to be asked why objects as different with respect to their uses as kilos of apples, a DVD, a liter of gasoline, a wrench, a calculator, a ton of copper, a computer monitor, an hour on the internet at a cafe, a shirt, are all called commodities. It also remains to be explained why, with 50 euros, I can buy a microwave, 10 dozen oysters, 50 kilos of nails, 2 hammers, 10 reams of paper, a pair of shoes, 6 seats at the movie theater, 3 hours of house cleaning, etc. The answer lies in the fact that these objects or services possess another dimension besides their use value, which is called exchange value. Every commodity therefore has a dual character, a use value and an exchange value at the same time. The latter is linked exclusively to the fact that the objects are not produced from the very start to satisfy social needs, but to be sold on the market. In communist society, as in the first human societies, the objects that will be produced will always have a social usefulness, but they will no longer have an exchange value. It is a society that no longer knows the commodity. But why is it that the quantities of different objects possess the same value and can be exchanged? The response is as follows. Two commodities have the same value because they contain the same quantity of invisible substance in its concrete form, the human labor that is necessary to produce them. It is therefore not a matter of the concrete labor of the tailor who made that suit, or the farmer who tended the apple trees, or the workers who manufactured the paper, but of human labor as a general activity. The labor time expended to produce a commodity is what determines the magnitude of value of exchange value. Commodities are exchanged for each other because they represent an equal amount of the same general labor, an abstraction from the concrete forms of labor. We shall therefore differentiate between concrete labor, which produces use values, and general abstract labor, which produces exchange value. This labor contained in commodities, however, must be performed under average social conditions, which obviously vary historically and geographically based on the degree of social development. When we say that labor time is the measure of the value contained in commodities, we're speaking of socially necessary labor time. It is not just because an aficionado of homemade furniture thinks that his own products can be sold on the market for a value corresponding to the labor time he expended in producing them. The value of a table is calculated on the basis of the socially average labor time necessary to produce a new copy of it. Our handyman has spent a lot of his personal time to fabricate his product. For example, if a table of comparable quality has sold in the store for 200 euros, which corresponds to 3 hours of social labor, it took our handyman 9 hours to make his table, including his purchase of raw material. There's no way he can expect to sell it for more than 200 euros, and certainly not for 600 euros, which might represent the social value of his expenditure of labor. The dual character of the commodity is something that is not obvious at first sight. The commodity does not allow one to see right from the start that its value is in proportion to the quantity of socially necessary human labor required for its production. Furthermore, its dual character seems like something neutral. The exchange value that is associated with it, and which dissimulates particular social relations, presents itself as a natural property. We shall see below the importance of the mystifying character of the commodity. 3.3. Labor power. Why do we speak of labor power rather than of labor? When a worker makes something, he might have many raw materials or objects, but he does not have at his side a box or a basket labeled labor that contains a substance that would be labor and that he would inject into the production process. Labor is not immaterial, it does not exist outside the power that is capable of producing it, which is human capacity, muscle and intellectual power that is mobilized to perform a task, whether the task involves picking apples, assembling auto bodies, or designing the structural components of a bridge. There is one commodity in bourgeois society that possesses a particular use value, the capacity to produce more value than is needed to reproduce it. The commodity is labor power, and that is a human's inherent capacity to mobilize his intellectual and physical potential to perform the most varied production task and finally to transform nature. Thus, what the capitalist buys from the proletariat is not his labor, but this particular commodity, his labor power, his capacity for labor, and the purpose of consuming it, insofar as its use value consists precisely in producing a supplementary value, an extra value, a surplus value. No other commodity consumed during the production process transmits more than its own value to the product, neither raw materials nor machines. In order for the exchange relation to exist, there must be a historical relation in which we have on one side of the capitalists, who have a monopoly on money and the means of production and subsistence, and on the other side the proletarians, who had been dispossessed of all their means of production and whose only wealth consists of their labor power, which they are all obliged to exchange for a wage. This has not always been the case, e.g. among the Indians of the ancient tribes, the Welsh, etc. It is not the case even now among direct producers, peasants, artisans, etc. So how do we define labor power? The same way we define any other commodity, by the average socially necessary labor time required to reproduce it. Before an individual is capable of performing productive labor, he must be reared, educated, and trained. Furthermore, he must eat, have a place to live, have clothing, consume electricity, travel. The sum of all these needs constitute the global total of what must be spent to maintain this labor power. Naturally, these needs vary on time and place. The share of leisure activity of a more pleasant level of consumption can vary, and may be very high or very low. There are numerous cases in history where the dietary habits of the masses were changed in order to reduce the cost of their maintenance, such as the campaign in favor of the potato, or getting the English worker to drink tea instead of milk. The crucial point to grasp here is that labor power is a commodity. Like any other commodity, it has a use value, the capacity to produce commodities, to be the source of value and surplus value, and exchange value, which is determined by the average socially necessary labor time required to reproduce it. 3.4. Surplus value. Why do we say that labor power, the capacity for labor, is a commodity that is capable of producing more value than it costs to its owner, the capitalist? Because the average socially necessary labor time required to reproduce labor power is less than the labor time during which the labor power is exploited by the capitalist, and because the value of a commodity is nothing but the labor time necessary for its production. The value of labor power is effectively lower than the value created over the course of a day or a month of work. The capitalist pays the former and appropriates the latter. The difference between the two is that we call surplus value. It corresponds to the unpaid labor supplied by the worker, or the surplus labor. For example, a capitalist who buys a day of work from a proletarian for 100 monetary units has the right to make the worker toil for 7, 8, or 10 hours, or as many as there are allowed by the prevailing law. Let us suppose that the elements we enumerated above, which are necessary for the reproduction of labor power, represent the either of 2 hours of production, or in other words, that 2 hours of labor are enough for the capital to be reimbursed for his advance. So that happens after the 2nd hour? Does the capitalist say to the proletariat, "Thanks, you've done good work, now you can go home and get some rest"? Of course not. He would take advantage of the contract they signed to employ him another 6 hours in the context of a normal legal working day, such as, for example, the 44-hour week in Brazil, in fact 40 hours in numerous enterprises, or 35 hours a week in France, but longer hours in England and the United States. And what are these 6 hours to a capitalist? Pure bonus labor that he did not pay for, free labor, which we have defined as surplus labor, the working time during which the surplus value is produced. Here one can see that the struggle for the reduction of the working day constitute an important component of the relation of forces between the capitalist class and the proletariat, insofar as they seek to reduce the time that can be devoted to the production of surplus value. An important consequence follows from these facts. Even a decent capitalist one who treats his workers well, who complies with the labor laws, and who remunerates labor power at the correct rate, and associates on a personal level with his wage workers, even this capitalist, as virtuous as he may be, is an exploiter, because his work produces gratuitous labor which he has not been paid for. Here, we can see that the power of Marxism, which is not a kind of morality, in which case it will be restricted to denouncing the miserable conditions imposed on the proletariat, but a theory whose proof has to be a force of a scientific truth. Exploitation is inherent to the capitalist social relation. This is why it does not matter whether the boss is a crook. He must be eliminated not as an individual, but as a representative of a social relation based on exploitation. And now that it has been fulfilled its task, we will see that the rising productivity of labor, the bourgeoisie as a whole, has become, for Marx and Engels, a useless characteristic. 3.5. Wages. We have seen that labor power, like any commodity, has a value, and that this value is determined by the average socially necessary labor time required for its production. Like any commodity, labor power also has a price, which is the concrete monetary expression of value. A commodity's value is socially determined by the quantity of labor that it contains, its market price. However, it's based on supply and demand. Commodities are sold at a price that is higher than their value if demand is strong, and below their value if demand is weak. What matters, however, are the variations around which a value is determined by the average socially necessary labor time required for the reproduction of the commodity in question. In fact, although we shall only briefly touch upon the topic, the question is more complicated than that. In the context of the capitalist mode of production, the market price of commodities do not gravitate around their value, but around their prices of production. The price of production is the price that results from the equalization of the rates of profit among the great masses of capital, but these prices of production are themselves ruled by fluctuations of value. During crises, when effective demand for all commodities falls, there is a tendency towards a generalized decline in the prices. This is one of the forms of devaluation that capital undergoes in crises of overproduction. The same thing happens to the commodity known as labor power. What the proletarian exchanges for his labor power in his wage, which is the price that of his labor power, we have seen that the value of the latter is constituted by the time it takes to reproduce and maintain it. For example, time devoted to the extensive training of a high skill level, but also the rapid wear and tear inflicted on the workers due to longer working day or more intense pace of work, tend to increase the value of labor power. We also have to take supply and demand into consideration. However, as they cause the variation of prices around the average value, if there are few workers, the sought after skills and demand for those skills is strong. Labor power will tend to be sold above its value, that is, at a higher price. If to the contrary, there are many workers, as in a period of high unemployment, wages will tend to fall, and labor power will be sold at a price below its value. Besides the unemployment caused by crises, Marx shows that capital maintains an industrial reserve army, a surplus population whose role is to maintain constant pressure to keep wages low. In its perpetual search for the maximum of surplus value, the capitalist class attempts to drive the price of labor power below its value and to reduce that value itself. For example, during the 19th century, the British capitalists praised the frugality of the French worker, who was malnourished and therefore cheaper. These same capitalists, with the introduction of cheaper products in the British diet, sought to reduce the value of labor, and Marx wrote, "In one of our days, aspirations have been left far behind, thanks to the cosmopolitan competition in which the development of the capitalist production has thrown out all workers of the globe." If it is no longer the case of simply reducing English wages to the level of those of continental Europe, but to reduce in the future, more or less close at hand, the European level to the Chinese level. 3.6. The constituent elements of capital. The concepts we introduced above, labor power, surplus value, wage, are fundamental in the critique of labor political economy. But one must also see the movement of capital as a whole, and the contradictions this movement manifests, in order to understand why and how it is historically condemned. The capitalist only advances the wage, To be in a position to exploit labor power and to extort from it a maximum amount of surplus value, he must also possess means of production: machines, raw materials, energy, buildings and urban real estate, and rural land in the case of agriculture. These things are what Marx calls constant capital. Such capital is called constant because it transmits its value to the product during the course of the production process. Meanwhile, the part of capital that is advanced to pay wages is called variable capital because it returns a variable value beyond its initial value. The part of capital, however, can yield a greater value only because it is exchanged for labor power, which is the only commodity that is capable of producing more value than it costs. Thus, commodity production that proceeds on an everyday basis in a factory will be composed of 1. One fraction of value takes the form of machines, more generally known as fixed capital, the fixed part of constant capital. This value is not transmitted all at once, but gradually, and is what economists call amortization. 2. The value of raw materials, fluids, etc. that enters into product. This is what is called the circulating part of the constant capital. 3. The value of the wages paid to the proletarians, which correspond to the variable capital. This is the paid portion of the working day. Marx calls it necessary labor. 4. Finally, the surplus value produced during the working day by these same proletarians. It corresponds to the part of the working day that is composed of surplus labor. Therefore, the value of the commodity is reduced finally to the quantity of labor that it contains, that is, the quantity of labor time that was necessary to manufacture it, with all the above components mixed together. The raw materials that were transformed were also produced by labor, and therefore acquired an exchange value in the capitalist mode of production. This value, just like the used-up fraction of the fixed capital, will merge with the value that is created in the production of the new commodity. Marx says that the value of this constant capital is transferred to the product. Here, we can clearly see one of the many difficulties that capitalism must face, which we shall address in the next chapter. When we can explain the role of machinery to make labor more productive, capitalism has a tendency to increase the share of constant capital in production, but this part does not create new value. It only transfers value that already exists. That's a key point. The relation between constant capital, C, and variable capital, B, V, explained in the formula C over V, represents what Marx calls the organic composition of capital, which is capital over variable capital. The fact that this constant capital over variable capital, the fact that this organic composition rises, that is, the mass of constant capital, undergoes a proportional greater increase as opposed to the mass of wages mobilized set in motion, constitutes a factor of contradiction in capitalist production, as the only goal of this latter is surplus value, which is the only product of produced by living labor. We shall see below the consequence that this has for the rate of profit in its development. I'll give you a hint, it has a tendency to fall. But what method can capital employ to further extend its search for surplus value? Historically, Marx distinguishes two methods: the production of absolute surplus value and the production of relative surplus value. These two types of surplus value are not necessarily mutually antagonistic. They can be combined, and they can also reinforce each other. In any case, absolute surplus value can only exist in conjunction with a certain level of development of the productive force of labor, and the relative surplus value can only exist if the working day is long enough. Since each type of surplus value forms the basis for the other type, they are distinguished by the historical development of their relations. 3.7. Absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. In its early days, when capital was beginning to take over the production on the basis of expropriation of the traditional producers, artisans, peasants, etc., a process that we shall examine more thoroughly in the third chapter, it began by prolonging the working day. Labor in agrarian economies was certainly arduous, and years with bad harvests brought hard times. But if the peasants spent a lot of time in the fields, there was also a lot of leisure time: breaks, lunch, snacks, repair jobs in the winter. It was, after all, a natural rhythm that dictated the organization of labor and its development over time. In work as it was conducted in the early manufacturing firms, which emerged in Europe in the 16th century, this rhythm was often considered considerably transformed, and it would undergo even more changes with the transition to large-scale industry at the end of the 18th century. An initial augmentation of the productivity is obtained due to the fact that numerous bearers of labor power are concentrated in a single location. This enhanced productivity makes the system of manufacture more competitive, even if it only utilizes the techniques employed by artisans by concentrating them and rationalizing their use. On this basis, the only way to obtain any further increase in the employer's share of unpaid labor is to prolong the length of the working day. Marx calls the surplus value that results from this prolonged working day absolute surplus value. For example, if the working day is 12 hours and 6 are necessary to reproduce the value of labor power, necessary labor, the working day must be extended from 12 to 14 hours if the employer wants to gain 2 more hours of surplus value. We should then have 6 hours of research, necessary labor, and 8 hours of surplus labor. Surplus labor time, i.e. the surplus value, would have increased by 1/3 without altering the necessary labor time, while the added expenditure of labor power is not remunerated. During the period before the Industrial Revolution, capital had no other option than to privilege this form of surplus value. On the limited technical basis that prevailed at the time in the system of manufacture, however, labor time could not be extended at will. In addition to the physical limitations, technical constraints, for example the absence of enough illumination to allow for night work, cultural restrictions, social rhythm, and customs that foster development to this trend also played a role. Capital had to wait for the introduction of machinery before it could generalize other methods for increasing the quantity of surplus value. By creating a technical base specific to capital with machinery, by eliminating human labor from the process of production, capital, on the basis of large-scale industry, gave itself the means to increase the quantity of surplus value produced by reducing the value of labor power with the growth of productivity. This surplus value that is obtained no longer by extending the absolute length of the working day, but by diminishing the value of labor power, or by modifying the relation between surplus labor and necessary labor, and therefore by modifying the relative magnitude between the two parts of the working day without prolonging the working day, Marx calls relative surplus value. Necessary labor is, just as its name implies, necessary for labor power to reproduce some value. Beyond that, it produces surplus value. In order to allow for a relative increase of the part destined to become surplus labor without increasing the length of the working day, the time spent in the reproduction of the value of labor power must be diminished, or a situation must be created in which the value created during the working day of the same duration should increase while the value or the price of labor power does not rise to the same degree. Thanks to general increase in the productivity of labor, capital can reduce the value of commodities that enter into the reproduction of the value of labor power. The latter's value falls, and therefore so too does the length of time necessary to reproduce the same labor power. Let us continue with our previous illustration, where the working day is 12 hours and 6 being absolutely necessary and 6 surplus labor. Let us assume that the general increase of our productivity of labor reduces the duration of necessary labor to 4 hours. The time spent producing surplus value would therefore be 8 hours instead of 6. Capital would have succeeded in increasing the mass of surplus value produced by 33% without prolonging the working day. Also, by increasing the intensity of labor, capital increases the value created in the same amount of time. In this case, as long as the value of labor power, or its price, is still the same, or does not rise in proportion to the increase in surplus value will grow. 3.8. Productive and unproductive labor. Marx, like many of the classical economists who preceded him, such as Adam Smith, distinguished between productive labor and unproductive labor. This is a side note. Unproductive labor is kind of a misleading term. It doesn't mean labor that's literally unproductive. It basically means labor not involved in the process of producing goods directly. A better term would be non-productive labor, but it's been a few hundred years, so it's good to change it. Anyways, the definition of productive labor within the framework of capitalist production is very clear. Productive labor is labor that produces surplus value for capital. To put it another way, the expression productive labor does not mean labor that produces something. If this were so, then anyone who putters around their house or likes to cook at home would be productive, but rather surplus value producing labor. This question is crucial because it profoundly encapsulates the entire problematic of exploitation and the definition of classes and class struggle. The proletariat, the productive class, is also, in the capitalist mode of production, the only exploited class. It is a matter of contraries. If there is productive labor, then there must also be unproductive labor and unproductive workers. For example, when the capitalist owner of a custodial service company employs 10 wage workers who clean offices, their value is productive labor. But when the same capitalist uses his own revenue, which when used this way is no longer capital, to hire a woman to clean his house, he does not employ productive labor for that reason. In the course of its consumption, this labor produces no surplus value. Thus, one of the few criteria that should guide us in determining whether a job, and therefore a worker or a group of workers, since the industrialization of the question is of little interest in itself, is productive or unproductive, involves ascertaining whether it is exchanged against capital or against revenue, the latter being the case, for example, with the bureaucracy and the civil service as a whole. Labor can, however, be exchanged against capital, and from this point of view it could yield a profit for the capitalist without consequently being productive. This is the case with all jobs in the sphere of circulation, banking, commercial middlemen, etc., and those dedicated to the incidental overhead cost of faux frais of production, insurance accounting. Consequently, the labor that produces surplus value and is therefore productive is the labor that is exchanged against capital in the sphere of material production. This implies that 1. While every productive worker is a wage worker, not every wage worker is a productive worker. Marxism shows that while the wage labor force is growing, it is its unproductive sector that is growing more rapidly, creating a material base for the emergence of the modern middle classes, the wage-earning middle classes. The middle classes of the past did not come from the capitalist mode of production intended to disappear. On the other hand, even if they do not produce surplus value, they can produce value, for example, peasants and artisans. 2. Productive labor is not identical with labor that produces a tangible good or a concrete object. 3. Productive labor is not the same thing as manual labor. The proletariat is not exclusively comprised of the socio-professional category blue-collar worker, or to put it another way, the concept of the working class in Marx is not restricted to manual workers. The same kind of confusion arises when industrial capital is wholly conflated with the industrial sector, strictly speaking. In fact, agriculture as well as the service sector can depend on industrial capital and allow for the production of surplus value. 4. Productive labor is not the same thing as the production of socially useful objects. The proletarians who produce weapons or luxury goods produce surplus value and are therefore productive. For precisely the same reason, unproductive labor does not mean labor that is useless or socially harmful. For example, communist society will need to perform social accounting, the role of which will all be more important as its costs will be much lower. 5. It is pointless to individualize the idea of productive labor. Marx shows that the characterizes capitalist production ever since its infancy is the existence of a collective worker, see above on cooperation, manufacture, and machine industry, that engages in material production. 6. The wage-earning middle class is not characterized by an intermediate wage level, as bourgeois sociology believes. The highest layers of the proletariat, or its most highly skilled fractions, can earn more money than many representatives of the middle class. The difference between them lies in the productive or unproductive character of their labor, rather than how much they are paid. 3.9. Formal and real subordination of labor to capital. With regards to the development, and not just the development, of the capitalist mode of production, Marxism employed the concept of the formal subordination and the real subordination of labor to capital. In this context, labor means productive wage labor. He is therefore addressing the way that the proletariat is subjected to the authority of capital. What do these terms, which are somewhat complicated and whose significance is regularly falsified, really mean? At first, capital could only be invested in what its owners found all around them. Amidst the conditions of production of the first society of their time, labor was therefore performed by, for the most part, with the tools, though whose technical features were rooted in tradition, like the spinning wheel and the weaver's frame, and the hand tools that were used in traditional trades: carpentry, masonry, pottery, shoemaking. One of the essential roles of capital was, during its first stage, to concentrate in a single location, workshop, manufactory, and later the factory, large numbers of bearers of labor power, thereby achieving an improvement in the general productivity of labor. See Chapter 13 of Volume 1 of Capital on simple cooperation. A trend that continues when the technical division of labor is widely implemented. This increase in the productivity of labor, which was made possible by simple cooperation and then by the division of labor in the era of manufacturing system, allowed for the increase of relative surplus value. Once these organizational systems of labor were introduced, however, since the advance of the productivity of labor is limited, the growth of surplus value can only be obtained in the form of absolute surplus value. Generally speaking, during the first period, the prevailing technical methods are not radically modified. The labor process in the various stages involved in production goods were still identical to, or very much like those, were typical of the craftsmen of the pre-capitalist era. This is what Marx meant by formal subordination of labor to capital. With regard to its form, the labor process remains the same, but it is subjected to the valorization process of capital. In other words, the spinner or the weaver, who worked alongside other spinners or weavers in the capitalist workshop, performed the same gestures with the same tools, but their social relation with these tools and with the product of their labor has changed. While the labor process was inherited from the forms of production that preceded capitalist production, it is now subjected to capital and to its exclusive goal, to produce the maximum of surplus value. With the formal subsumption of labor to capital, the scale of production grows. A large number of workers are gathered under the command of capital. This formal subordination of labor to capital therefore corresponds with the origins of the capitalist mode of production, and its existence is predicated on the fact that the labor of the wage worker is based on a pre-capitalist technology. Simple cooperation, like the era of the manufacturing system, is therefore typical of the formal subordination of labor to capital. For although its goals are always to produce the maximum surplus value, the labor process has not been fundamentally transformed. For this reason, in the framework of the formal subordination of labor to capital, once a certain level of development of the productive force of labor is stabilized, surplus value can only be produced under the form of absolute surplus value. On the basis of the techniques employed before capital entered the field of production, the extraction of surplus value could only be increased once the new organization of labor that made the labor was more productive was established. By resort to such procedures as the prolongation of the working day, the formal subordination of labor to capital knows only this form of surplus value production. Socially speaking, we now have before us the fully established capitalist mode of production. That is, we have a social relation that changed the proletarian to an instrument of labor that stands outside him and against him as capital. From this perspective, the formal subordination of labor to capital is a general form of the capitalist process of production. Technically speaking, however, this form of capital has not yet modified the general form of labor process. Its technology is not yet specific to, or strictly characteristic of, the capitalist mode of production. With this first concentration of the means of labor, however, simultaneously uniting the constant capital with its tool and raw materials with the variable capital and its proletarians, and with the division of labor that soon followed this concentration, the foundation was laid for the development of a form of technical progress that was characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. In order to drive the extraction of surplus value to a higher level, it was not enough to make men work longer hours. They had to be made to work in a different way. Marx therefore spoke of a moment when capital really dominated labor, that is, when it developed a technology that was its own, dictated by the specific goal of capital, the production of a maximum of surplus value. a form of production that was no longer in the legacy of the old forms of production. Thus, the real subordination of labor to a capital in an intrinsic form, truly characteristic of the capital mode of production, its most highly developed form. It includes the formal subordination of labor because in its general contours, which consist in the facts that it subjects a significant number of workers to capital, this characteristic endures throughout the entire lifespan of the capitalist mode of production. The form of subordination of labor to capital has a specific dimension which is, on one hand, characteristic of an already concluded historical epoch of the capitalist mode of production, but it also has a general dimension that endures through the entire history of this mode of production, and which is inscribed within the framework of real subordination. In a way, the real subordination of labor to capital succeeds the formal subordination of labor to capital, yet it preserves it and establishes it at a higher level. With the real subordination of labor to capital, the production of relative surplus value can really begin to flourish, and with it, the extraordinary growth of the exploitation of the proletariat. The capitalist mode of production therefore underwent a historical transformation that led to a develop towards an increasingly more pure model, although this model is never completely realized. All branches of production fall under the rule of capital, which prevails in its battle against the independent producer. Marx says that capital is value in process, value that valorizes itself. This expression, which is of a philosophical nature, is abstract, but this motion is embodied quite concretely in the insatiable quest for a surplus value. A quest for which the capitalist mode of production sets in motion the productive forces and attempts to take advantage of all the results of science and technical development in order to place them at the service of this valorization process, and of this quest for maximum surplus value. It is by way of development of the machine industry with the Industrial Revolution that the formidable increase in productivity are made possible with the capitalist mode of production put at service of the production of surplus value, and which communism will place at the service of the reduction of working time and its tedium in order to allow human beings to enjoy their free time without dreading the arrival of the next day. Rate of surplus value, the rate of profit, and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. We now must probe more deeply into the general process of capital and understand how the principles upon which it is based are the very same factors that lead to its downfall. In short, the more capital seeks surplus value, the more obstacles it encounters in the growth of that very same surplus value. When he relates surplus value to necessary labor and to surplus value to variable capital, Marx speaks of the rate of surplus value, which is defined by the rate, S over V, the mass of surplus value produced divided by the variable capital advanced. This is a measure of the degree of exploitation of labor power by capital. Let us suppose that the capitalist advanced 100 euros of variable capital for a working day of 8 hours, and that 4 hours represents the necessary labor. At the end of the day, the value corresponding to realizing living labor represents 200 euros, and the capitalist will be able to pocket a surplus value of 100 euros. We would say that the rate of surplus value is 100%. But when it comes to the preconditions for the production process, living labor power, is not enough. It produces only because it sets dead labor in motion, in the form of the means of production, machines, raw materials, etc., that we have referred to, following Marx as constant capital, C. If we relate our 100 euros of produced surplus value not only to the 100 euros of variable capital, V, but also to the total amount of advanced capital, that is C plus V, we do not get the same result. If the amount of constant capital advanced is to 100 euros, it must be related to the produced surplus value, which is also 100 euros, so that 100C plus 100V equals 200. The rate of surplus value is always 100%, but the rate of profit, which represented the ratio S over C plus V, that is the surplus value divided by the total amount of advanced capital, C plus V, is no more than 50%, 100 over 200. We see here that, by definition, the rate of profit is lower than the rate of surplus value. Among the preconditions for the development of the capitalist mode of production, however, we must include the development of machine industry and the productivity of labor that accompanies it and results, as we have seen, in the rise of organic composition of capital. Let us suppose that our capitalist buys more expensive machines to allow him to increase the productivity of labor and which require fewer workers to operate them. At the same time, all of the other factors remain unchanged. If productivity increases, the mass of raw material and the intermediate products used by the same labor power rises in tandem. We would therefore have the following situation, abstracting from the modifying effects of productivity. 200C plus 80V plus 100S. The rate of surplus value, S over V, is still 100%, but the rate of profit has fallen to 28.5%. Marx defined this phenomenon as the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. It is the most important law of political economy. It is a tendency because, like every law, its action is modified by particular circumstances. It is also affected by counter-tendencies. It only manifested over the long term and in certain circumstances. If there was no counter-tendencies, capitalism would quickly collapse. Among these counter-tendencies, Marx calls attention to the increase in exploitation of labor by way of rising productivity and constant intensification of labor process itself, the depreciation of the elements of constant capital. What we said about the value of V also applies to C. Let us suppose that, in order to make a machine, it used to take 50 hours of labor, but now it only takes 25 hours. The value of the constant capital represented by this machine has fallen by 50%. Likewise, if rising productivity diminishes the labor time needed for the production of raw materials and the intermediate products, their value falls. Capital has been able to raise its technical composition by slowing down the increase of its value composition. This is why, in defining the organic composition of capital, what is being addressed is the value composition insofar as it reflects the technical composition. Relative overpopulation. That is a fraction of the population in society that is unemployed or sporadically employed, which retards the technical progress because capital would rather employ low-paid workers than invest in modernization. This is the case in luxury industries generally, and the tendency to the expansion of the luxury industries follows in the wake of the expansion of capital, mainly to satisfy the needs of the upper middle class. Generally speaking, the growth of industries that employ more living labor than average contributes to slowing down the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The cycle of accumulation. Capitalist production takes the form of circular motion, a cycle. The cycle is as follows. Money. Money capital advanced by the capitalist. Commodity. Purchase of the means of production and labor power. Production. The production of commodities and the actual process of production. Commodity. Commodities generated by the production process offered for sale. Their value is higher than the value of the commodities that entered the process at first, since they include surplus value. Money. The realization of the value of the commodities in money. At the end of the cycle, there is more money capital than was advanced at the beginning of the cycle. It has been augmented by surplus value. The capitalist advances capital in the form of money. He converts it into means of production and labor power in order to be able to produce commodities. These commodities, however, are no good to him. If he cannot sell them, to put it another way, the movement of labor power of money capital into commodity capital is pointless without the continuation of the movement, the transformation, the realization of the commodity capital and money capital increased by the surplus value that was produced. As the phrase cycle of accumulation implies circulation, it is circular movement, in principle endless, we would be remiss. However, if we do not take a look at what happens in a different moment of the cycle, it can be compared with the cycle of water. It can undergo all the metamorphoses that are required for the completion of the cycle, but there's a big difference between its different states, which can profitably be studied separately. Water vapor, produced by evaporation, clouds, rain and water again. It is always the same material, H2O, manifested in different forms. In our inquiry, it is capital that is presented in diverse forms and passes from one to the other. from the money form to the form of productive capital, means of production and labor power, to the commodity form, and once again to the money form. In this movement, capital realizes its goal, its supreme end, to produce the maximum of surplus value. That is, the capitalists are not trying to recover the sum he invested in production, but to obtain more than he invested. We must not forget that everything that lies behind these objects, money, commodity, is capital. The capitalist invests his capital in production, and that capital undergoes metamorphoses. It is constantly changing. At one time, it has the form of money. Another time, it is the means of production, machines, raw material, labor power. Then it takes the form of a commodity destined for the market, where it is restored to its money form, and so on. If the rhythm of the movement is steady and sustained, there is no problem. But if the time that elapses between two metamorphoses grows too long, there is a risk that the cycle will be broken. This is what happens in crisis. If commodities that have been produced cannot be reconverted into money, and therefore capital cannot follow its crisis cycle to be reincarnated in money and to be reinvested, it is idle, and the threat of devaluation looms. This is why, for Marx, crises are crises of overproduction. There is too much capital. Too many commodities have been produced that cannot be realized. On one hand, if money capital does not obtain enough surplus value, it will not accumulate. The absence of realization as the absence of conversion of money capital into the elements of productive capital, means of production and labor, are two aspects of the same phenomena that is characteristic of general crises of overproduction. That is, the economic crises that are typical of the highly developed capitalist mode of production. The first crises took place in 1825. But what will the capitalist do with this surplus value if he does succeed in realizing it? If he were to spend all of it, there will be no accumulation. In order to pursue its objective, the production of a maximum of surplus value, this surplus value must at least in part capitalized, that is, retransformed into capital, in order to initiate a new cycle of production on an enlarged scale. If at first the capitalists do not have enough money to invest in this production, we have seen that it was also necessary for him to have means of production and labor at his disposal. Since he has an additional sum to inject in turn into production, he has to find additional means, other machines, raw materials, and other labor power. This forms the basis for the movement of capital, of the accumulation of capital. Marx calls it extended reproduction and compares it, quoting the words of the bourgeois economist Sismondi, to a spiral. This is how the preconditions for the development of capitalist society were created. It is not enough to have money. This money must have someone who will employ it usefully as capital. In other words, the capitalist must be able to transform money into means of production, MP, and labor power, L, in the market. We have already mentioned, along with the commodity, the division of labor, the precondition sine qua non for the effective exchange in accordance with the commodity common pattern. Its value can be reckoned in contrast with the labor that would have been required to reproduce it at a lower level of organization in the past. Now, we once again cross paths with the division of labor, but this time on a social scale. There must be industries that complete the picture. Some produce machine tools, others produce raw materials, electronic components, etc. There must also be a class of free workers who can pass under the authority of capital to supply productive labor. The process of production is therefore also a process of reproduction of the capitalist relations of production, a process of production and reproduction and of their expansion. This expansion is becoming increasingly more unfavorable for the productive class. The bourgeois economist who preceded Marx understood none of this, and this is all more true of our contemporary economic professors. They think that the additional value that the capitalist recovers from the sphere of commerce, which is why a commodity can be sold for more than its value, by means of which one can pocket a surplus value, or they imagine that the means of production are inherently endowed with the ability to produce value. A faster machine will produce more value, as will land that is more fertile, new inventions, etc. We have seen, however, that surplus value is created in the sphere of production by the productive wage workers. This is not price gouging, but the product of the exploitation of the proletarian class. Marx criticizes his adversaries with regard to another point, the economists. The latter, as good defenders of bourgeois law, always see the relation between the capitalists and the workers from the point of view of the contractual relation between two persons. This relation must not be viewed from an individual point of view, however, but rather in such a way as to discover how the relations between the two classes, that is, all the capitalists against all the proletarians, are held together. The purpose of the movement of capital, known as accumulation, is the acquisition of the maximum of surplus value. It is an absolute necessity for capital to constantly expand production, since it is the basis for capital's valorization. This means that a value invested in production only has a reason to exist if it yields, once it leaves the productive process, a higher value, composed of the value advanced in the surplus value. Capital, as Marx says, is value in process, value that remorselessly seeks to increase its own magnitude. That is the only way it can be within the logic of capital accumulation. Economic relations in the relation of exploitation. Bourgeois political economy, like the bourgeois labor laws, view the transactions that take place between the workers and the capitalists as an equal relation of two possessors of commodities who exchange their goods. In this case, the ability to work for a certain amount of time, labor power, is exchanged for money, the wage. Marxism, however, reveals that exploitation lies concealed behind the equality of this transaction, and that this relation of exploitation is produced and perpetuated. On the one side, the process of production never ceases to produce and reproduce capital. On the other side, the worker emerges from the same process that the same man he was when he entered it, an individual, source of social wealth, utterly lacking his own means of realization. His labor, which becomes the property of the capitalist, can only obviously be realized in the process, and products that slip through his hands. Capitalist production, insofar as at the same time that consumption of labor power by the capitalist, endlessly transforms the product of labor, not only into commodities, but into capital, into value, that channels the creative force of labor into means of production that dominate the producer, and into means of subsistence that the worker himself buys. The continuity alone, or this periodic repetition of the capitalist process of production, reproduces and perpetuates its basis, the worker in his quality as a wage worker. Profits and superprofits. At the level of society as a whole, the productive class engenders a growing mass of surplus value. This surplus value is shared out among different fractions of the ruling class in various forms. In particular, in the enterprise, it takes the form of profit. Today, the term profit is often employed in a moral sense, as the equivalent of a parasitic commercial profit. Thus, the term that someone would sell a commodity for more than its price of production for gain or profit is condemned. In scientific terminology, Marxism, however, profit in its totality is by no means to be equated with commercial dishonesty. Profit is a fraction of the surplus value. All commodities, taken as a whole, are sold at their value, and it is because they are sold at their value that, taken as a whole, the capitalist can appropriate surplus value. This surplus value is basically divided into profit and rent, thus drawing a line between the class of capitalists and the class of landed property. Within the capitalist class, the profit will be shared out among the capitalists in proportion to the capital they advanced, equalization of the rate of profit. Capitalists in trade and commerce, therefore, obtain an average rate of profit that is equal to the general rate of profit, the same as the industrial capitalists, even if their effective contribution to the production of surplus value is less. The same profit will be divided between the enterprise profit and the interest that has to be paid to the capitalist financier. But that is not all. Taxes are the lifeblood of the state, and they lay claim to the part of the surplus value, but also part of the social wage. Nor should we forget that the wage of the social task of supervision and management that are attributed to the capitalist and the wage and means of production of the unproductive classes are just so many other forms of surplus value. Surplus value is therefore shared out on the scale of society as a whole among different dominant classes, and within the bourgeois itself, its different fractions. It even reaches other layers. Marx stridently insists, however, on the single origin of the mass of the surplus value, which is then shared out among different protagonists. At first, it is the industrial capitalists. This term applies to capital employed in any sphere whatsoever and not just capital of manufacturing industry, who guarantees the production of surplus value thanks to the exploitation of productive wage labor. Contrary to the assertion of the current of the petit bourgeois critique of capitalism, it is not the banks or the world of finance that is the enemy, as opposed to the virtuous industrial capitalist. Get this to the ACP. The capitalist mode of production is not based on finance, but on the production of surplus value and its accumulation thanks to the exploitation of the proletariat. Theoretical considerations with respect to the agrarian questions also provide Marx with an opportunity to address the issue of the various forms of superprofit. In the view of the fact that they are derived from productively differentials, social monopolies like landed property in the countryside, or from monopoly pricing, strictly speaking, by the fact of a demand that is greater than the supply because of a relative scarcity, as in the case of fine wine, or because such scarcity is deliberately created, by trademark and patent claims, for example, they are exemplified in the different forms of land rent. Far from constituting a theoretical novelty or a particular phase of history of the capitalist mode of production, Marx shows how average rate of profit and superprofits and competition and monopoly are articulated on the basis of the action of the law of value. Fictitious capital. Alongside the accumulation of real capital, another form of capital also developed, which Marx followed in the footsteps of other economists, calls fictitious capital. At first, this term embraced legal claims to fractional ownership, interest, stocks, IOUs, government debts, letter of exchange, etc., that correspond to real capital that has been loaned. It does not matter to whom it was loaned. Since these claims can be alienated, for example at the stock exchange, at a bank, or at a brokerage firm, they are the objects of a particular kind of market, which also subjects to specific laws. In such markets, a hurricane of speculation takes place that allows some of its participants to pocket some of its surplus value. For petit bourgeois socialism, the spear is the root of the crises, and the acquisition of surplus value from speculative activities and interest payments, or from dividends in the case of stocks, in return for the loaned capital, are the consummate forms of exploitation. We have already seen, however, that these aspects of capitalism are only various forms of surplus value, at the same level as profit, rent, taxes, and wages of the unproductive classes. Surplus value, once it has been abstracted in the productive sphere, is the object of competition and play a relations of force in order to determine how it will be distributed. The communist movement seeks to abolish wage labor and other commercial categories, rather than seeking to rein in the most blatant manifestations of social parasitism. Another meaning 2, of the term fictitious capital concerns the fraudulent use of borrowed capital. Once the money is loaned, it is dissipated by the borrower, who does not put it to work as capital. Besides professional thieves and con artists, we must not forget that the line between a business facing difficulties that is trying to get a loan in order to weather a bad stretch, hoping that business will pick up, and the business that is buried under helpless debt is a fine line indeed. In this respect, the state itself, the biggest creditor by far, which is in such a hurry to spend money as revenue, may very well be viewed with suspicion. History is riddled with its bankruptcies and debt restructuring plans, which situates it in the sense amongst the great providers of fictitious capital. One last aspect of the idea of fictitious capital, meaning 3, resides in the excessive creation of debt, in order to realize the additional surplus value. New means of payment must be created. When they exceed the capacities of accumulation, since there are other markets, they must necessarily exceed these necessities, and on the other hand, it is in the interest of the banks to loan as much money as possible, since they consider that their risk exposure is limited. Ignorance, greed, state guarantees, technical manipulation in both financial engineering as well as computerized decision-making, etc., would be factors that reduce this risk, whereas at any given moment, they might amplify it. The growth of credit is accompanied by the growth of excessive creation of debt. This phenomena leads to the inflation of commodity prices, inflation of fictitious capital, in the meaning 1, claims to be titles and ownerships, inflation of land rent, the price of land of real estate investment shares, the inflation of fictitious capital, in the meaning 2, and in short, to the inflation of social parasitism. When inflation is transformed into deflation, These phenomena, which are themselves vectors of crises, only comprise one aspect, amongst the most visible features, of the crises of overproduction, whose origin lies at the heart of the capitalist production. The dynamic of capitalism and social classes. The discovery of capitalist mystification. Marx in his time performed a task that was both scientific and revolutionary. Scientific because he revealed, beyond the phenomena recognized by the various protagonists of society, the deep foundations and provided an explanation that broke with the interpretation of the bourgeois economist of his time. Revolutionary because he was able to discern, behind the functioning of the capitalist economy, what it was that created the material preconditions for the revolutionary break. Furthermore, his scientific work could only be situated on a revolutionary point of view, on the point of view of the proletariat and of the society of tomorrow, communism. This is why Marx's fundamental work on economics bears the subtitle Critique of Political Economy. More than a century and a half after its birth, the materialist conception of history is still facing an uphill battle for acceptance. On the defensive since the end of the 19th century, reinvigorated by the Russian Revolution and then annihilated by the counter-revolution that followed the crushing defeat of a revolutionary wave in the 1920s, the defeat of Germany, Hungarian, Chinese revolutions, and the Russian regression and counter-revolution with the victory of Stalinism. Marxism is not yet done learning the lessons of the defeats of the proletariat. The systematic recontextualization of concepts, theoretical elements, and conclusions that have been advanced for almost a century and a half, and the application of the results of this endeavor to the understanding of the development of the transformation of the contemporary capitalist mode of production, are imperatives for the cause of the emancipation of labor. The evolution of social classes. The evolution of social classes, and among those classes, that of the productive class, constitutes one of the most important questions that Marxist theory now faces. The 20th century was simultaneously the most vital and most deadly century in history. The world's population quadrupled and people lived much longer, while the century's wars claimed 120 million victims, and malnutrition affected 100 million. At the other extreme, 300 million are obese, with its entourage of tragic consequences, shorter lifespans, infant mortality, 6 million per year, physical and mental illnesses. The capitalist mode of production has grown even faster than the population. The proportion of wage workers in the world's working population is constantly increasing and now accounts for the majority. In the countries where the capitalist mode of production is the most highly developed, wage workers represent 80 to 90% of the working population. The proletariat has become the majority in society. The social classes of the past, independent peasants, artisans, and small-scale entrepreneurs, are disappearing. Their alleged independence is often only formal, and their existence is restricted to the pores of bourgeois society. In the worst cases, their activities are merely the effect of generalized precariousness and unemployment. Take agriculture for instance. It is still the world's #1 employer, but its workforce no longer represents the absolute majority of the active population. A large proportion of this agrarian population, such as the small-scale peasantry, certainly produce value, but not surplus value. It does not have a wage relation with the capitalist, but has a relation with the landowner when it is not itself the owner of the land it cultivates. In the most developed countries, it only accounts for a very small part of the active population, whereas the majority of Marx's time, within this sector, wage workers playing an ever greater role. The capitalist mode of production is becoming more involved in agriculture. It submits to its own laws, it ruins the peasantry, and who then joins the industrial reserve army and swell the ranks of the urban population. Besides the proletariat, the capitalist mode of production has two other basic classes, the capitalists and the landowners. The analysis of the formation of prices in agriculture in the sphere of the production of raw materials shows that this is at least the least fertile, or most inaccessible land for mines and surface extraction that sets the prices of production, and that market prices oscillate around this price. In the capitalist mode of production, the relevant prices of raw materials and resources that are indispensable for survival are therefore higher than the prices of any other commodity. Industrial luxury is easier to produce than agricultural necessities. Also, the monopoly of ownership of land further exacerbates this process by serving as a brake on the development of productivity in these spheres of production. Beyond these spheres, we also have to take into account the particular effects linked to monopoly pricing and the strict meaning of the term, for the finest wines, for example. The examination of these different phenomena shows just how disastrous the capitalist mode of production is for social metabolism. The contradiction of the capitalist mode of production drives the antagonism between the city and the countryside, and the imbalance between the urban and the rural worlds to a fever pitch. This contradiction becomes so pronounced that the bourgeoisie, incapable of bringing about a harmonious distribution of the population over the territory, is forced to assume responsibility for, and to feed into control, the movement of the populations that have been rejected by its system of production. Thus, the masses expelled from agrarian regions pile up in the suburbs of the megalopolis. Urban rents, however, are skyrocketing. In France, for example, they have long ago surpassed by far the levels of rural land rents. Although buildings, for the housing and for productive activities, occupy a much smaller surface area than agricultural land, their general price is higher, and the relation between the price per square meter of the best residential or office spaces and that of the worst agricultural land is constantly rising. At this point in time in France, the ratio of this relation is on the order of 1 million to 1. In the better neighborhoods of Paris, the price per square meter easily reaches 10,000 euros, while the worst agricultural land can be bought for another 1,000 euros per meter. Taking the most extreme cases, one could easily multiply this figure by 10 to arrive at the actual discrepancy. Bourgeois society will never be able to correctly feed humanity, nor can it provide it with decent housing, nor can it be a good caretaker. From the point of view of the general interest of the human species, of the land, the forest, and the soil, the health of the well-being of the people, the metabolism between man and nature. Middle classes, past and present. What is true of agriculture is also true of industry and the services. The influence of wage labor is spreading and makes the rules of the capitalist mode of production increasingly more obvious with each passing day. Outside the peasantry, the artisanal sector and retail commerce, which is still thriving, which represents the classical historical middle classes, a modern wage-earning middle class has emerged. As we've seen, the capitalist mode of production, in its quest for surplus value, reduces the value of commodities by reducing the average social labor time that is necessary for their production. It must, however, find an outlet for this growing mass of commodities, and capital must multiply the unproductive expenditure and activities in order to cause these commodities to circulate and to realize its commodity capital in the form of money capital, market surveys, advertising, salesmen, credit insurance, etc. The time of circulation increases relative to the time of production. The multiplication of focal point of accumulation of capital with its entourage of small enterprises leads to the creation of a class of small-scale capitalists whose income and rent come from surplus value and therefore represent so many overhead costs proportional to their number. This is also accompanied by the emergence and further development, both in large and small enterprises, of intermediate categories which are responsible for business administration, accounting, and organization. Finally, modern capitalist societies have witnessed a considerable growth of the state and the bureaucracy. Insofar as they are paid from the state budgets, that is, by way of taxes and public debt, civil servants are neither exploited, they do not produce surplus value, nor do they confront capital when they sell their labor power, nor are they proletarians. Their labor power is not exchanged against capital, but against revenue. With the defeat of the proletariat in the 1920s and the rejuvenation of capital that followed in its wake, particularly after the Second World War, capital experienced decades of growth of the production of surplus value that went hand in hand with the increasing degree of skill disposed of by the labor force. This was only possible by imitating the communist program, by realizing a social democracy in order to provide, within the limitations of the capitalist mode of production, advances with respect to the reduction of the working day, improved healthcare and sanitation and the educational opportunities, while simultaneously reinforcing the iron heel, police, army, etc., and the state bureaucracy. All these phenomena have engendered the creation of jobs for civil servants and caused the state to become a major employer of labor and sometimes the leading employer. All of these phenomena mean that the wage does not itself, strictu sensu, imply a relation of exploitation. When labor power is exchanged against revenue, or when it is employed in the sphere of circulation, or even when it forms a part of the fa fray of capitalist production, accounting, billing, administration, etc., it is unproductive. It produces neither value nor surplus value, even if it can yield a profit. Every proletarian is by definition a wage worker because he has nothing to sell but his labor power, but not every wage worker is a proletarian. The considerable expansion of the productivity of labor since the Second World War may be conceived in two ways. The first conception is that it will be considered that this social wealth is produced by the population of wage workers as a whole. The latter receive, in the highly developed countries, a wage equivalent that varies between 1/2 and 2/3 of GDP. It is then easy to conclude that the exploitation, both in absolute and relative terms, of the proletariat, in this case confused with the population of wage workers in general, is not getting worse, and that the interests of capital and labor are therefore reconcilable. In the second conception, the distinction is observed, which is crucial in Marx, between a productive fraction of the working population and an unproductive fraction. The latter may also be composed of wage workers. In this case, the production of surplus value must be attributed exclusively to the productive fraction. It therefore considered that the production of value and surplus value is completely dependent on the proletariat rather than on the wage-earning worker as a whole. Consequently, its exploitation is, when viewed from this perspective, considerably more important than the way it is conceived in the first conception. It shows that the interests of labor and capital are irreconcilable. The implication of this last point with respect to an evaluation of the possibility of communism are crucial, for the fact that the productive sphere is concentrated among the proletariat and not spread among the entire wage-earning labor force is testimony to an unprecedented level of production attained by the development of the capitalist mode of production, a productivity whose product must be wasted so that the boiler does not explode. This gives us an idea of the impressive possibility that might issue from a reorganization of productive functions, the abandonment of useless, socially harmful sectors, and a generalization of productive labor amongst the members of society as a whole, while reducing the individual working time, which bring in its wake major changes from the very first stage of the revolutionary process. At a time faced with catastrophic prospects offered by bourgeois society, numerous currents are advocating quote-unquote degrowth, decrementio, decroissance, the Malthusian restriction of the production of wealth, often in the name of ecology and protecting the planet, and it is salutary to recall that the economic catastrophes that are now battling society have a social origin, and that the leadership of society by the revolutionary proletariat is an absolute necessity. The role of modern middle classes. A large part of these unproductive wage earners comprise what are called the modern middle classes. The fact that they earn a wage or salary allow us to distinguish them from their predecessors in the past, artisans, peasants, etc., discussed above. Contrary to the claim of bourgeois commentators, the phenomena of the expansion of the wage-earning middle class was perfectly anticipated by Marx. Yeah, he has at least 4 quotes, directly talking about this. So it's kind of strange even Marxists will say, yeah, he was wrong on that when he wasn't. By living off of surplus value, that is from the exploitation of the proletariat, these classes defend an interest that is close to that of the exploiting classes. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx explains the role of the managerial capitalist, defining his social function, his psychology, and his development. The managerial capitalist, to distinguish him from those who only have legal claims on the ownership of capital, personifies capital. He functions only as a personified capital. It is his job to obtain the maximum production of surplus value, which in turn presupposes that he must obtain the highest possible yield from his labor force at any given time, and also that he must augment, in sheer size and extent, the accumulation of capital. Production for production's sake, the exaltation of the constant growth of the productive force of labor by the productive force of labor. This is the job of the capitalist, the fanatical agent of accumulation. The capitalist is only interested in exchange value, and this is why, among the first qualities displayed by the pioneers of capitalist development, one finds frugality, austerity, and avarice. These bourgeois quote-unquote virtues faded with the passage of time, however. The capitalists yielded to the sirens of the unproductive consumption of surplus value. It is true the ongoing process of the concentration and centralization of capital have made the expansion of surplus value possible, by means of which their consumption can be increased without making a significant dent in their accumulation. On the other hand, however, this consumption became a professional necessity. The display of their wealth is a way to obtain credit, to inspire confidence, and to retain their positions in business and social circles. This tendency does have limits for capitalists, however, and the pleasure in spending money are experienced with a kind of bad conscience, for he is always aware of the contrary inclination, that he must fan the flames of accumulation. If the capitalist were to renounce the pleasures of accumulation in favor of the accumulation of pleasure, he would renounce his function. The sanction that would fall upon the capitalist who would unproductively consume his surplus value rather than accumulate it would be his disappearance under the blows of the competition. From the point of view of capital as a whole, two obstacles stand in the way of the capitalist mode of production. If we imagine a society that is composed only of proletarians who confront the capital that has no other concern than the production and accumulation of surplus value, there would be a vertiginous growth of the productive forces and of the productivity of labor. This prodigious development would rapidly undermine the foundations of capitalist production itself by driving the devaluation of capital to its climax, by creating an immense accumulation of commodities that would be more and more difficult to sell and to be realized. Capital would therefore be led all the more rapidly to overproduction and crises. On the one hand, a development of productivity by production, concomitant with a development of the personal wealth of the capitalist, might lead capitalist production to weaken, to lose its dynamism, to become complacent before the mass of profits, without making an effort to systematically stimulate the development of labor power. Capital would renounce its historical mission much more rapidly. Since 1845, Marx and Engels insisted on the fact that at the same time that the capitalist mode of production develops the productive forces, the latter are transformed into destructive forces. As long as the capitalist is instilled with the passion for accumulation, the love of production for the sake of production, it is necessary for society to also express to an equal degree the passion for spending, the love of consumption, for the sake of consumption. We have seen that the capitalist cannot totally devote himself to this function without renouncing his own existence. The dialectical aspect of production, consumption, is expressed in another class. A class that represents spending, consumption for the sake of consumption, must emerge. Like the capitalist class, despite its increasing taste for consumption, it cannot monopolize its function, and because of a certain point, it enters into contradiction with its social function. The class that would best represent the passion for spending and consumption is the middle class. This is the function of the economic middle class in Marx, and embodies the passion for spending and plays a regulatory role in the framework of the capitalist mode of production. The volcano of production is limited in its expansion and at the same time stimulated. Beyond this aspect, however, the middle class also plays a social and political role by serving as a shield for the ruling classes. The capitalist class in landed property. With the growth of the capitalist production, capital was concentrated, that is, accumulated in the same center. Under the impulse of advances in production of the development of the minimal capital necessary to reach the social average of the effects of competition and crises of the growth of credit, which puts the social capital at the disposal of part of society, capital was centralized. That is, with all else remaining equal, the number of centers of accumulation was reduced. For example, it is said 80,000 multinationals, whose number has grown at an unprecedented rate and which produce 10% of the world's GDP and control 2/3 of the world's trade, that the output of their subsidiaries is greater than the total volume of world trade. At the same time, with the credit system and the development of social forms of property, corporations, public enterprises, cooperatives, pension funds, holding companies, etc., the separation of ownership from capital is affirmed while the protagonist divides up into two professional categories. Capitalist managers on one hand, who are responsible for the management of the capital and financial capitals on the other, who lay claim to the interest on capital property. The differences between capitalists and landowners dissipates, and these classes tend to merge. capitalists buy land, forests, and real estate that constitute the goal of society with the social property, while the landowner becomes shareholders and capitalists. The bourgeoisie as a class of owners is being increasingly removed from the production process that has continued to hinder, facilitating the onset of crises, and thus accentuates its parasitic nature. The concentration and centralization of capital. The concentration and centralization of capital are relative, not absolute phenomena. At the same time that multinational capital and big businesses are becoming more important, small and even minuscule enterprises are multiplying in vast numbers. The accumulation of capital in new focal points, whether because it is stolen from older societies or generated by means of new capital investment, is all the more important to the extent that these new fields of accumulation do not require vast amounts of capital to initiate operations. The growth of servers that call for a more direct relation between persons in a relative territorial proximity are examples of such new focal points. Marx had already described an identical phenomena with respect to the production of luxury goods, which employs more labor. The production of more sophisticated products of a superior or luxury quality grows with the development of productivity. The development of a skilled labor force that can all the more easily win its autonomy in the view of the fact that conceptual labor accounts for an increasing share of the global labor time and the creation of a commodity also favors this trend. The causes of the recurrent emergence of these small enterprises are numerous. If the determination to escape from wage labor can be a motive for a certain number of individuals, most of them have no other choice than to try to exist on their own on the market when they cannot find a regular job that pays a wage. On the other hand, the various statutes and more or less archaic regulations that exist in various countries with respect to pharmacists, lawyers, doctors, architects constrain the growth of wages in these sectors. The effect of such small enterprises is also a necessity for the most productive enterprises to be able to earn super profits, and they also serve the bigger firms as a pressure valve in many ways. Lastly, but not least, in the English original, innovation is not synonymous with small business, which is more flexible than big, long-established enterprises. A Darwinian process of selection of the new producers and service providers of new markets is underway. 100 small businesses are born, 10 survive a year. One is successful, and one successful small business will be bought out at a good price by a big corporation. The process of concentration and of constant emergence of new units of production also affects agriculture. If the world population has quadrupled over the course of the 20th century and agriculture accounts for about half of the working population, the number of peasants and small-scale peasant landowners has also grown, giving rise to a momentous worldwide disparity with regard to the productivity of big capitalist agriculture as opposed to peasant agriculture, which cannot produce enough to ensure its own self-sufficiency due to a lack of land. The productivity of highly developed agriculture, which can produce 1,000 tons per employee per year with a labor force of several million workers, is much lower among 2/3 of the world's active agricultural population. For the hundreds of millions of people who have experienced the effects of the Green Revolution, it falls to 50 or even 10 tons per worker, depending on whether or not they own the draft animal. Finally, the approximately the lowest 1/3, many hundreds of millions of people who live in poverty, they produce less than 1 ton per worker per year. If we disregard the questions of how this productivity is attained in its limits, hundreds of millions of farmers are potentially threatened with the prospect of being evicted from their land and herded into cities, and dialectically, a couple of million practicing a rational form of agriculture will be enough to satisfy the agricultural needs of the human species, thus freeing up labor time. More than ever before, the agrarian revolution, like the resolution of the antagonism of the city and countryside, lies at the heart of the social revolution. Accumulation and crisis. In the search for the maximum surplus value leads the capitalist mode of production to crisis of overproduction. These crises assume a periodic character, and their seriousness increases along with the degree of development of capitalist production. The more highly developed the latter, the greater the social impact of these crises. Crises of overproduction are characteristic of the highly developed capitalist mode of production. The first such crisis of a new type broke out in 1825, and after almost 2 centuries, the bourgeois world is still being battered by social earthquakes that leave desolation in their wake. Their frequency and intensity are not only not decreasing, but one must expect the new records will regularly be set. These facts cast ridicule on and expose the incapacity of both the predictions and theories of the economists, as well as the policies, reformers, and other attempts to establish some kind of economic control over the development of capital. By seeking the maximum of surplus value, capitalism develops the productivity of labor as if the latter had no limits in the framework of this mode of production. The enormous mass of commodities must be realized in money, and a particular relation, which capitalist production tends to violate, must exist between productive consumption and unproductive consumption, individual and collective. Because it encounters difficulties finding markets for these vast masses of commodities, restricts the share of wages and of the productive class, and multiplies new focal points of accumulation that derange the equilibrium of the relation between production and consumption, bourgeois society is predisposed to the overproduction of commodities. On the other hand, if the accumulation of capital does not engender enough surplus value, if this growth of productivity falters and the rate of profit falls precipitously, it is overaccumulation, the production of capital, that is in danger. At the same time, fictitious capital, titles to ownership, is inflated under the combined effect of the accumulation of real capital. Speculation and overextension of credit becomes one of the most powerful levers of increasing the employment of the productive forces or for giving rise to overproduction. The search for the maximum surplus value takes various forms. 1. A longer working day. 2. Rising productivity. 3. Other forms favor the creation of more value and surplus value in the same time. 4. Increasing the intensity of labor, the creation of more commodities at the same value in the same time. 5. The refinement of the complexity of the labor process. The same labor power produces more or less value, dependent on the type of labor, simple or complex, to which it is applied. 6. The increasing the skill level of labor. Labor power that is more skilled possesses relatively more value than unskilled labor power and produces more or less in the value in the same time. 7. The optimization of the place occupied by the national workforce in the international division of labor. At the same time that they pursue their excessive goals, the maximum of surplus value, capitalist production develops the productive forces within the limits characteristic of this new mode of production. By doing this, the potential for production as well as for overproduction is constantly increasing. To ward off this contradiction, to counteract its effects, capital sets in motion an ensemble of responses of various kinds. We may classify them with respect to the type of answer they offer. 1. The facilitation of the sale, the realization of the social product, equals the development of credit. 2. The search for market in new fields of accumulation in other countries equal exports, struggle for the conquest of the new markets. 3. The extension of the domain of needs, the creation of new needs equals the development of advertising and marketing, which conferred new attraction upon the commodity. 4. Diversification, creation of new needs, creation of new use values, equals development of means of luxury consumption. One of the interests of this sector is that it generally allows the production of a greater mass of surplus value by virtue of the fact that it employs a relatively higher proportion of living labor. Furthermore, since this sector has a lower than average organic composition, it also a factor that tends to contribute to higher rate of profit. 5. The historical evolution of use values and needs retards the decline of unitary value of commodities. Revalorization of use values, evolution of needs, yesterday's luxury is today's necessity. 6. Planned obsolescence of commodities, deliberate squandering of resources. 7. Sequestration of capital, accumulation of capital fixed that is not immediately productive. Monumental works of art, large-scale products of public work, such as canals, and which absorb surplus value without producing an immediate effect on the productivity of labor. 8. Development of class consumers which consume without producing, an unproductive class. A class of consumers is necessary. The underconsumption theorists, especially Malthus, are aware of this necessity. It cannot be the proletariat whose consumption is linked and is all the more limited as the relative wage falls within the progress of capitalist production, and who therefore cannot account for it. Its wage may rise, but only within strict limits. This modern unproductive class is the wage-earning middle class. With its growth, it limits the rate of accumulation and demand for the means of consumption rises, and with it, the consumption of higher quality products and luxury goods. 9. The tendency of the rate of profit and the rate of accumulation to fall. Accumulation slows growth down, growth slows down, capitalism proposes its contradictions by renouncing its mission. Crises do not automatically cause wars or revolutions, but they contribute to them, and if the revolution is the only solution for the proletariat that has a goal of putting an end to its exploitation and bringing the course of capitalist production to a halt, war is likewise the last-ditch solution that capital can resort to in order to regenerate itself, even at the risk of destroying the human species. Towards the classless society. One of the great dramas of recent history is the political disappearance of the proletariat, which has been dispossessed of those aspects of its existence that once made up its revolutionary character. On 2 occasions, the Second and Third International, its international party fell into the hands of counter-revolutionary forces. We shall not take the time at this point to recite the historical circumstance that drowned the proletariat in the counter-revolution in the 1920s. After the achievement of an international scale of the most heroic feat of emancipation in history, whose high point was the seizure of power in October 1917 in Russia. After that period, the proletariat disappeared as an independent political party, and therefore as a class that was conscious of its historical goals. Not only were its institutions, traditions, songs, flags, and emblems transformed into symbols of its oppression, and its theories sterilized, denatured, caricatured, and transformed from a revolutionary theory to an instrument of social conservatism, but societies whose systems of production were strictly capitalist, the USSR, China, Cuba, etc., were depicted as examples of real socialism. During this period, the proletariat only fought at the extreme left wing of democracy, falling behind the parties of the other classes. By doing so, it has exchanged the goal of its emancipation for improvements in its living conditions. The reduction of the working day, raising its standards of living in its life expectancy, public schools for its children, access to medical care, etc. In short, everything that characterizes quote-unquote social democracy. Its efforts have also helped to bring about the victory of political democracy and external universal suffrage and women's rights. The number of countries ruled by democratic constitution, organized in the form of democratic republics, is constantly growing. The proletariat has therefore cleared the way for the final confrontation with the bourgeoisie. It has allowed the bourgeoisie to direct the development of the productive forces and to lead them to a point where the contradictions have built up to such a degree that the evidence of the need for a classless society to abolish them is becoming increasingly more obvious with each passing day. Even if it will be difficult for it to resume its revolutionary struggle, the world proletariat is always situated in conditions that render it, as the only exploited class, a revolutionary class whose goal was the communist revolution, the complete overthrow of the entire structure of contemporary society. The revolution constitutes, now more than ever before, a crucial venture for all of humanity. Nothing has taken place that will refute the essential proposition of the Manifesto of the Communist Party of 1848. The political capacity of the proletariat will obviously depend on the circumstances, on the degree of preparation, and on the energy it devotes to organization itself in an autonomous political party on an international scale, with a coherent revolutionary program opposed to all other parties. Its historical capacity is permanent, however, since it inscribed in the heart of the social relation that characterizes the capitalist mode of production. The proletariat, the productive class, not only creates surplus value, it also creates capital, which reproduces the social relation in its entirety. This is presented, however, in a capitalist society in an upside-down and mystified form. The proletariat and its alienation. At the heart of productive labor, at the heart of the process of production, the proletariat produces, with its labor, a value, reproduction of value advanced by constant capital and wages plus the surplus value, that not only slips from its grasp, but also turns against it. Its labor is transformed, right under its nose, into its opposite, into capital. The proletariat is dominated by its own labor, which confronts it. The phenomena is defined by Marx as an alienation, that is, its labor is turned into something foreign to it. Exploitation, which we recall only strictly concerns productive labor, and therefore the proletariat, is at the same time alienation. The other classes are also victims of the general mystification, the reification of persons in the personification of things, the fetish character of the commodity and of capital, or even the fact that the capital or land appear as autonomous sources of value, entities, vested with life that are capable of producing value on their own, which fails in the real nature of social relations, but they are not themselves capable, by their own efforts, of either penetrating this veil by means of scientific analysis or tearing it open by overthrowing the capitalist relation. We have spoken, Chapter 1, of the origins of the capitalist mode of production, and then in Chapter 2, we spoke of Marx's analysis of the commodity. The appearance of the commodity presupposes a society in which the communitarian bonds that establish the framework a priori for human activity as social activity are dissolved, at least partially. At the same time, the evidence of social relations disappears. Each producer produces in a private way and only enters into contact with the other producer by way of exchange. This is a description, however, of the exchange of products realized with his labor, and which are presented at the same time as commodities and not simply as useful objects. Not only do human relations appear to be mediated by the exchange of commodities, but this very same exchange is the precondition for the existence of a social relation between individuals whose activities are separated and carried out privately. The fact that the socialization of labor is effected in exchange, that this is by a mediation that is not controlled by the individuals, casts a veil over reality from the very start, which Marx compares to a religious phenomena. Since commodity production has been generalized and labor power has been turned into a commodity, the mystification that accompanies the system has been intensified. This mystification becomes stronger as the capitalist mode of production becomes more highly developed. The capitalist class possesses the totality of the means of production and of exchange in all their forms, and in this respect, capital appears to be the motor force of society, its productive side. Marx speaks of inversion because capital appears to be productive when in fact it produces nothing on its own. It is content with combining the setting and motion of all elements that are necessary for production, which are the very same elements, basically since they underwent historical evolution, that were involved in the production in pre-capitalist forms of production. In every form of production, the necessary elements are raw material, means of labor, tools, and productive agent, the worker. The capitalist society therefore masks and inverts the real underlying relation. Capital thus appears to be productive, the creator of wealth, when it is human labor that is actually the productive force. By propelling this movement as a whole, by pursuing the quest for a maximum of surplus value, by developing the productive force of labor, capital masks the fact that the real source of the surplus value, which also makes the development of capitalist civilization possible, is the productive labor performed by the proletariat. The latter not only produces the material basis of society that it also helps to reproduce and expand, but it also reproduces and perpetuates capital and the relation of exploitation inherent to it. An infernal spiral is thus set in motion in which the proletariat creates an alien existence that escapes its control and dominates it. In the material sense, capital confronts it in the forms of building and machinery, for example, but also in a more general way, more anonymously, by which capital dominates and exploits the proletariat. Advances in science and technology are turned against the worker. With circulation and competition, this mystification is completed. Interest-bearing capital, fictitious capital, and land appear to be sources of income, that's the Trinity formula, without having an indirect relation with labor. The equalization of the rate of profit that levels the profits of equal masses of capital that employ unequal masses of labor power also obscure a process that from the very start transcends the framework of the international individual capital. In this equalization process, the participation of capitals that operate in the sphere of circulation as commercial capital makes its contribution to this veil by making social relations appear more opaque, while the chance hazards of the success and failures of individual capitalists subject to competition also contribute to the mystery of capitalist production. Counter-revolutionary forces often successfully take advantage of this mystification and in good faith, insofar as they are its victims. For example, counter-revolutionaries will emphasize, to enrage the masses, the role of the banks, finance, and financial capital, while praising the virtues of industrial capital. Yeah, that reminds me of a group of people. It thus overlooks that it is the latter kind of capital that lies at the heart of the relation of exploitation. That is, the industrial capital that subjects the proletariat and makes it produce the maximum of surplus value, which assumes the various forms, profit, interest, rent, taxes, which are then fought over the different fractions of the bourgeoisie and its acolytes. In the course of this process, the entire essence of human labor is turned upside down. It is in this respect that this capitalist society is the most violent in history, since it denies the very existence of the person who is subject to capital. That is, to value in this process, as violent as they were, the relations of master and slave and lord and serf were relations between persons, and were clearly identified as relations of power and exploitation. Spartacus knew why he must rebel, and that was why he was up against and for whom he had to fight. In the capitalist mode of production, the social relation between classes takes the form of a thing, capital, value and process, which dominates the proletariat. This explains the sense of powerlessness that can overwhelm the proletariat. Capital dominates everything. It seems like a deus ex machina, like a force of nature, as immovable as the sky and the mountains, invisible. It is, however, only an upside-down image of reality, and to rebel against it is to put the world back on its feet. This is the role of revolutionary theory, and since the arms of critique cannot replace the critique of arms, that of revolution as well, the revolution of the modern proletariat is distinguished from all revolutions that preceded it, because it entails not merely the seizure of power by a new class that is capable of developing a new mode of production, but the reunification of the species with itself, and the definitive abolition of all the conditions of exploitation of one class by another. This is possible because the capitalist mode of production develops, by virtue of its tendency to augment the productive power of labor, the objective material conditions for the construction of this new society that requires neither the framework of private property nor a ruling class to grow. Furthermore, the development must necessarily be achieved by way of the abolition of this private property, which has become an unendurable obstacle. The social classes must be abolished, not for moral reasons, but because they constitute so many obstacles to social development. The sinking feeling that there is no way to put an end to the role of capital is associated with the fact that the process of exploitation functions like a spiral, in which all the energy of the exploited class is concentrated against it in order to reinforce and further develop the conditions of its exploitation. At the same time, this process unfolds, however, the conditions for capital's destruction are taking shape, since the proletariat, which instills life in the capital, is at the same time the class that can bring it to an end. It only needs to rediscover its autonomy by severing the bond that chains it to the capital in order to begin the revolutionary transformation of society and to take the first step towards a classless society. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx describes communism in the following manner. Let us now picture ourselves, by way of change, a community of free individuals, carrying on the work with the means of production in common, in which the labor power of all the different individuals is consciously applied as a combined labor power of the community. All the characteristics of Robinson's labor are here repeated, but with the difference that they are social instead of individual. Everything produced by him was exclusively the result of his own personal labor, and therefore simply an object of use for him. The total production of our community is a social product. One portion serves as a fresh means of reproduction and remains social, but another portion is consumed by the members as means of subsistence. A distribution of this portion amongst them is consequently necessary. The mode of this distribution will vary with the productive organization of the community and the degree of the historical development attained by the producers. We will assume, but merely for the sake of a parallel with the production of commodities, that the share of each individual producer in the means of subsistence is determined by his labor time. Labor time would, in that case, play a double part. Its apportionment in accordance with a definite social plan maintains the proper proportion between the two different kinds of work to be done and the various wants of the community. On the other hand, it also serves as a measure of the portion of the common labor borne by each individual and of the share in the part of the total product destined for individual consumption. The social relations of the individual producers with regards both to their labor and to its products are in this case perfectly simple and intelligible, and with the regard not only to produce but also to distribute. After the capitalist mode of production, communism. The perspective of a classless society, a society without a state and without wage labor, is not a noble idea that must be translated into reality. Communism is only possible because its material foundations, beginning with the socialization of the means of production, have already been created in the framework of the development of the capitalist mode of production. We have seen in this movement, capital tends to concentrate and centralize, creating vast industrial entities subject to planning in the framework of transnational corporations on a world scale, e.g., the automotive and aerospace industries. This development leads on the world market to a finely woven network that embraces the entire world, in which it is almost impossible to distinguish islands that might be protected from crises or could escape the laws of capitalist production. But this tendency also expels small producers, consolidates the productive forces, and rationalizes technologies on an international scale is confronted by the obstacles that are inherent to the capitalist mode of production. These obstacles are expressions of what Marx calls the contradiction between the development of forces of production and the relations of production. The latter become, at a given moment, a historical development too narrow. Production itself requires coordination on a vast scale, beyond borders, and this coordination is hindered by the bourgeois in national relations of production. In the view of the catastrophe course following by capital, it would be advisable that major policy relations of production. In this view of the major policy decisions with regards to energy, natural resource, agriculture, land use, and manufacturing production should be made and consciously oriented on a world scale. In accordance with the interests of the associated producers, rather than with the demand of the productionist surplus value that characterize capitalist production, capital is therefore afflicted with an unsustainable contradiction, since its own interest impels it to constantly strive to perfect the unity of the productive apparatus and the organization of the circumulation of commodities and money, and to develop the productive forces of labor as if it had no limit. But it cannot consistently pursue this goal to its conclusion without negating itself. This contradiction, as we have seen, is regularly manifested in increasingly more serious crises of overproduction. Private property and wage labor, as well as the social division of labor, have been transformed from factors of historical development in the beginning of the history of capital to real obstacles to the continuing development of humanity. As the form squeezed into a narrow framework, the communist base that is housed within the heart of bourgeois society is crying out for room to grow, a demand that can only be satisfied if a sufficiently powerful force can shatter this constraining framework. Private property itself, by the way of the processes like nationalization, regionalization, municipalization, and other forms of public capital, cooperatives and joint stock companies that simultaneously allow for the centralization of power and the dispersion of ownership, holding companies, institutional investors, pension funds, is assuming a social character by abolishing private property within the framework of private property. From a materialist point of view, this constitutes one of the bases for the development of communism, which is not an unrealizable ideal, but a necessary imposition by the development of society itself. A world market was one of the preconditions for the existence of capital. Marx saw it as one of the material conditions for the development of the communist movement on the international scale that he desired. With the failure of the revolution in 1848 in Europe, Marx and Engels asked themselves whether the revolution could be crushed in our little corner of the world, while capital was still enjoying the prospect of expansion everywhere else. For its part, Stalinism invented and utilized the doctrine of socialism in one country in order to develop capitalist relations of production in Russia and to dominate and suffocate all the autonomous expressions of communism on an international scale. Communism is utterly incompatible with the idea of national development. It can only exist on an international and world scale. Today, the considerable development of the capitalist mode of production all over the planet, even taking into account the unequal levels of development in different regions, renders the material possibilities for the transition to a classless society more mature. Marx, in his various works, did not write much about communism and its contents, and what he did write did not provide explicit definitions. When the question did arise, however, it is presented as the radical inversion of the present situation, the recovery by the human species upon escaping the capitalist matrix of its vital functions. Communism is a society that abolishes alienated labor, wage labor, in order to articulate necessary labor and free labor on another basis. By the means of socialization of the means of production in the exchange, it is the community of the associated producers that makes the decision in organized society. The free development of each person is achieved via a transition that entails the reduction of necessary labor and sharing among all the members of the society who are old enough and healthy enough to work. At the same time that it implements a policy of polytechnical training, society fights against the social division of labor so that everyone who is capable of doing so engages in manual labor, and people work at mainly different kinds of tasks, and conscious efforts are made to abolish the antagonism between the city and the countryside. In communism, money and the value form are products of labor disappear. The individual right to participate in social labor for a certain amount of time that will be considerably diminished compared to the current amount of time accounted for by necessary labor, in return for what he will be consumed is recognized after subtracting from the total amount of products and labor time the useful elements earmarked for the expansion of society, for collective consumption, and for the members of society who are incapable of working to satisfy their needs, at first in a limited way, meaning without any other limitation than those of satiety and common sense. The revolution aims at the abolition of wage labor. In the community of associated workers, the relation of domination between the possessor of the means of production and the proletariat has disappeared. By way of the mediation of the community, the labor of one individual becomes directly social. This directly social character of production is frequently mentioned by Marx. In communism, individual labor no longer exists in an indirect fashion, but directly as a component part of total labor. The indirect fashion that Marx mentioned is none other than by mercantile relations that connect the capitalist with the proletariat, a relation that can only exist as long as the former possesses the monopoly on the means of production and exchange, and the latter has only its labor power. Overturning the terms of this exchange will make it possible for the real human essence of labor to be manifested and for the productivity of labor attained by the development of machine industry to really serve human needs rather than being exclusively oriented towards and directed by maximum valorization of capital. What was valid in Marx's time is infinitely more valid now. All the preconditions for the abolition of private ownership of the means of production and exchange and the enjoyment of collective organization of society are completely mature. The prerequisites for a revolutionary rupture. To bring about a revolutionary rupture, we must once again turn to the contradictions that undermine this mode of production due to its nature, due to the very existence of its economic and social organization. By constantly raising the productivity of labor, developing the productive forces, capital creates the preconditions for a new society. Capital itself ends by showing the relation of the production characteristic of the capitalist mode of production have become too constraining for it to continue to stimulate the development of productivity. A new mode of production, new relations of production that correspond to a classless society and that lift humanity out of its prehistory so that it can consciously prepare for its future must be established. Marxism proves that it is an inevitable phenomena and that the history of the capitalist mode of production is the history of the revolt of the modern productive forces against the modern relations of production. This revolt is regularly manifested in the form of crises over the course of which capital, regardless of its form, machines, money, commodity, labor power, is drastically devalued. Commodities are destroyed, machines idled, bankruptcies, disastrous prices, deflation, unemployed labor power. In other words, the accelerating rise of the productivity of labor made possible by machine industry and incorporation of science into production. And the surest guarantee that today's society will necessarily end up as a society of abundance is also the factor that poses the most serious threat to the foundations of this society. The time will come when capital and capitalist class not only can be overthrown because of the material basis of collective, directly social labor, freed from the mercantile restriction and from the valorization of capital is sufficiently developed, but they must be overthrown in order to assure the continuation of human history. This transformation, however, can be neither gradual nor automatic. If society is pregnant with a classless society, the baby is so big that it must be removed by cesarean section from the womb of a bad mother who is ready to commit infanticide. What the hell is that metaphor? This cannot happen spontaneously when the time arrives when the productive forces have reached a level where communism will naturally arise. At this continuity, a revolution is necessary to serve the thousand threads of mercantilism. The first precondition for this is the conquest of political power by the proletariat organization in a political party that is distinct from and opposed to the other parties. Just as capital produces the preconditions for its own abolition, it also produces the class that will execute the sentence, the proletariat. Marx writes, "The proletariat is revolutionary or it is nothing." The proletariat, insofar as it is the bearer of this revolutionary power, and strong thanks to a scientific conception of the world, Marxism, and capable of initiating the elucidating activities whose purpose is the overthrow of the power of the bourgeoisie in its society. For Marx and Engels, it is only by way of constitution into a party that the proletariat exists as an organized and therefore conscious social force. In the housing question, Engels summarizes this view of German scientific socialism on the necessity of the political action of the proletariat and of the dictatorship of the proletariat as the transition stage of the abolition of classes and with them the state. He points out that the ideas had already been expressed in the Communist Manifesto, and since then on innumerable occasions. In other passages, the precondition of the constitution of the proletariat into a political party is clearly expressed. By taking the necessary measures to dismantle the bourgeois state and to abolish private property in exchange of commodities, the revolutionary proletariat breaks the infernal cycle that transforms the labor of the proletariat into his enemy, at the same time that it reorientates the productive forces of society, which does not mean that communism can immediately realize its integral program, but rather that there is a qualitative leap that society will potentially take that will lead it from one sphere to the other. This stage of political transition is what Marx and Engels calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. A revolutionary party will have to define the measures that at the present time, on the basis of the development of the modern productive forces, which are incomparably more highly developed than those of 1848, will be necessary to shatter the state machine and lead society towards a classless society. These measures, which may vary from one country to another, and its implementation will depend to some extent on the state of the relation of forces in the international revolutionary situation, might take a form similar to the following. Drastic and immediate reduction of the working day and the integration of the time devoted for polytechnical training, including training for learning how to administer the proletarian semi-state, whose organization aims to achieve a maximum of simplicity in the remaining time devoted to labor. Generalization of labor and manual labor for all whose members of society are old enough and able to work. Measures directly towards the socialization of domestic work, cooking, house cleaning, laundry, childcare. Rotation of positions and sharing collective tasks in the form of civil service. Development of public sectors based on the free provision of services, health, education, etc. Confiscation of housing for the purpose of immediately improving the situation of those who live in substandard housing or who are homeless. Arming of the proletariat, creating a militia that will enforce the implementation of the proletariat's decisions. The transfer to the hands of the state of banks and the insurance companies that creation of a single financial entity implement social planning and accounting for the purpose of allocating labor power among the branches of industry. The transfer to the hands of the proletariat state and of large enterprises. Measures intended to facilitate the organization of small enterprises into larger bodies and mutual use of their means of production in order to permit the increase of social productivity, one of the preconditions for the reduction of labor time. Prohibition of night work and a rotating shift labor when it is not strictly necessary, such as in healthcare and security. A moratorium on new construction in big cities and their vicinities, measures to reconcile the city and countryside, development of labor force in agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. Suppression of indirect taxes, institute of a progressive tax on rent, abolition of the right of inheritance, the introduction of social certificate based on labor time, the equivalent of labor coupons promoted by Marxism in the 19th century to administer individual consumption. This certificate is not money, so it can accumulate and be used for labor power. For more on this, see the audiobook I did on understanding labor certificates. Mandated elected delegates who can be recalled at any time. delegate compensation to be equal to the average wage, suppression of parliaments, dismantling of state administration and local government in order to restore the management of social life to the community and of the associated producers, establishment of councils on a territorial basis, Soviets, that will be responsible for the administration of society and which will unite the executive, legislative, and judicial powers, unification of all countries that have carried out the revolution and abolition of borders, establishment from the youngest possible age a system of education that combines basic learning, manual labor, sports and creativity, and participation in collective life. Draconian separation of church and state, relegation of religious activity to the strictly private sphere. The capitalist mode of production has played a crucial role in the development of humanity by developing the productivity of labor and machinery, by creating the world market, by constantly unifying the conditions of production and exchange, and above all, by creating an international class, the proletariat, capable of taking into its hands the productive apparatus and leading society towards a society where neither exploiters nor social classes exist. The capitalist mode of production has thus created the preconditions for the transition to a superior society. The continuation of the capitalist mode of production, its very survival, its seizure of all means of production and of life, and the perpetuation of its mad career constitute great disasters for humanity. By pursuing the development of productivity and labor, capital pursues its course towards the maximum of surplus value. It brings the growing mass of proletarians under its rule, at the same time that the further development of its productive powers throws them into the street. By destroying the other forms of production, it also creates a situation which neither the hundreds of millions of African, Chinese, Brazilian, Mexican, etc. peasants, nor the millions of unemployed and excluded persons in Europe and the United States will be able to find a place that is based on the exploitation of the proletariat. At a time when all the preconditions for creating a framework of harmonious life for humanity exist, famines, crisis, wars, and other catastrophe are on the horizon for this century that is only just beginning. Only the proletariat can rise up and overthrow the present order and establish a classless society, communism.